The first time I heard the name Richard Hale, he was already dead. A lawyer called me at 8:17 on a Tuesday morning and asked if I was Emma Carter. When I said yes, he told me Richard Hale had left me his entire fortune, his house, his company, his accounts, more than $12 million. I thought it was a scam. Then he said, "There is one condition, Miss Carter. You have to find out why he chose you." I laughed because there was no possible reason. I was 34 years old, worked as an office manager, and lived in a small apartment above a bakery. I had never met a Richard Hale. I had never even heard of him. The lawyer gave me his office address and asked me to come that afternoon. Before hanging up, he added, "Please come alone." I remember staring at my phone afterward, wondering what kind of stranger could leave a fortune to someone he had never met. I told my husband Daniel that evening. I expected him to laugh with me. Instead, his expression changed completely. He asked me to repeat the man's name. "Richard Hale," I said. Daniel looked toward the window and became unusually quiet. Then he asked, "Did the lawyer say how he knew you?" I shook my head. Daniel nodded slowly and said, "You should stay away from this." It was the first time I had ever seen genuine fear in my husband's eyes. The next morning, I went to the lawyer's office. His name was Michael Grant. He placed a thick folder in front of me and explained that Richard Hale had spent years preparing his estate. Every document was legal. Every signature had been verified. I was listed as his sole heir. "Why me?" I asked. Michael looked uncomfortable. "That's the question he wanted you to answer yourself." Then he slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My name was written on it in handwriting I'd never seen. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It showed a young woman standing beside a little girl. I recognized the girl immediately. It was me. I was about 6 years old, but I had never seen the photograph before. My mother had always claimed we had very few pictures from that period. I turned the photograph over. There were 4 words written on the back. "I watched over you." Beneath them was a date from 28 years earlier. I stared at the photograph until my hands began to shake. I asked Michael where it came from. He said Richard had kept it in a private safe. "Was he there when it was taken?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "I don't know." Then he handed me another document. It was a list of instructions written by Richard. The first instruction said I was not to sell the house. The second said I was not to trust anyone who tried to take control of my inheritance. The third instruction was stranger. Before accepting anything, Richard had written, "Find the red door." I asked Michael what that meant. He said he didn't know. I asked why Richard would leave me $12 million without explaining anything. Michael looked at me and said, "Because he believed you would understand when you found it." I left the office with the photograph in my purse and one terrible feeling in my stomach. Richard Hale hadn't chosen me randomly. That evening, I searched the internet for Richard Hale. His face appeared everywhere. He had built one of the largest private construction companies in the state. Newspapers called him brilliant, ruthless, and extremely private. He had no known children, no wife, no relatives listed publicly. 3 days earlier, he had died unexpectedly at 62. The strange part was that several articles mentioned a mysterious woman who had once been connected to him, but nobody knew who she was. I showed the photograph to my mother. The moment she saw it, her face lost all color. She didn't ask where I'd found it. She simply whispered, "You weren't supposed to see that." I felt a chill run through me. I asked her who Richard Hale was. She stood up, walked to the kitchen, and closed the door behind her. When she returned, her eyes were wet. "Emma," she said, "you need to forget his name." I had never heard my mother sound frightened like that. She refused to explain. I asked if she had met Richard. She said no. I asked why she recognized the photograph. Again, silence. Then she said something that made no sense. "Because he wasn't supposed to find you." I asked what that meant. She shook her head. "Please, take the money and walk away. I stared at her. Mom, he left me $12 million. She answered quietly, that's exactly why I'm afraid. That night, Daniel asked what my mother had said. I told him almost everything. He became quiet again. Then he asked whether the lawyer had mentioned a house. I said yes. Daniel immediately asked where it was. I gave him the address. His reaction was subtle, but I noticed it. He already knew the location. How? I asked. He said he'd seen it in the news years ago. But something about his answer didn't feel right. The following afternoon, I drove to Richard's estate. The property was enormous, hidden behind tall trees and an iron gate. The house looked abandoned, even though the inside was immaculate. Michael met me at the entrance and handed me the keys. Richard wanted you to enter alone, he said. There are no employees here anymore. I stepped inside. On the hallway wall hung dozens of paintings. At the end of the corridor was a red door. I froze. The red door was exactly what Richard had described. It was smaller than the other doors and had no handle on the outside. Michael looked at it and said, I've never been able to open that. I ran my fingers over the wood. There was a tiny metal plate near the bottom. It had my initials engraved into it. My heart started pounding. Richard hadn't simply known my name. He had prepared something specifically for me. I searched the house for a key. After almost an hour, I found one inside an old desk drawer. It was attached to a small silver tag with a number 17. I returned to the red door and inserted the key. The lock clicked immediately. The room was dark. There was no furniture except a chair, a desk, and a small television. On the desk was another envelope. This time, the message on it was different. If you are here, they already know. I didn't understand who they were. I opened the envelope. Inside was a flash drive. I plugged it into the computer on the desk. A video appeared. Richard Holay was sitting in a dark room, looking directly into the camera. Emma, he said, if you're watching this, I failed to reach you while I was alive. I stopped breathing. He knew my name. He continued, there is something you were never told about your childhood. Richard explained that he had known about me for 28 years. He had watched me grow from a distance. He knew where I went to school, where I lived, and even what I wanted to become when I was a teenager. I couldn't understand why. Then he said, I wasn't stalking you. I was protecting you. He paused before adding, your mother believed she was protecting you from me. She was wrong about one thing. The video ended with a warning. Do not confront your mother yet. Then the screen went black. I sat there for several minutes, unable to move. My entire childhood suddenly felt different. Every family photograph, every move we'd made, every time my mother had told me we needed a fresh start. Maybe none of it had been accidental. I called Daniel. He didn't answer. Then I noticed something on the desk. A second photograph. It showed me at 12 years old standing outside my school. Someone had taken it from across the street. On the back was another message. She was not the only one watching. I suddenly felt exposed. I locked the room and left the house. As I drove away, I noticed a black SUV parked near the gate. It started moving as soon as I passed. I didn't know who was following me, but I knew one thing. Richard had been telling the truth. When I arrived home, Daniel was waiting. He asked where I'd been. I told him I had gone to Richard's house. His jaw tightened. I told you to stay away. I asked why he cared so much. He said he was worried about me. I showed him the photograph from the red room. His face changed instantly. Where did you get that? I asked him why he recognized it. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, Emma, you need to trust me. That was the moment I stopped trusting him. I asked Daniel if he'd known Richard. He said no. I asked whether he'd ever been inside that house. Again, no. But his eyes kept moving toward the photograph. Finally, I said, you're lying. He stood up and walked away. I followed him into the hallway. He turned around and whispered, "There are things about your past you don't want to know." I replied, "Then tell me." He wouldn't. Instead, he told me to leave the inheritance alone. I asked whether someone had threatened him. He said, "Not me." Then he looked at me and added, "You." I felt a cold wave pass through me. Before I could ask another question, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and immediately walked outside. Through the window, I watched him answer. His face became serious. When he returned, he said he needed to leave. I waited until he was gone. Then I checked his desk. I had never searched through my husband's things before, but nothing about our life felt normal anymore. Inside a locked drawer, I found an old identification card. It wasn't Daniel's name. The photograph was him, but the name underneath was different. There was also a small black notebook. On the first page was one sentence. Subject, Emma Carter. Status, protected. I read the notebook until my hands went numb. There were dates from years before Daniel and I had met. Notes about my workplace, my apartment, my mother, even my daily routines. Someone had been monitoring me. But one sentence stood out. "Do not allow Thomas Vale to locate her." I searched the name. Thomas Vale was the current CEO of Richard Hale's company, the same man who had publicly spoken at Richard's funeral. I called Michael immediately. I asked whether Thomas Vale had access to the inheritance. Michael said Thomas was trying to obtain temporary control of Richard's company. "Why?" I asked. Michael replied, "Because if you take ownership, he loses everything." Then he asked whether I'd seen anyone suspicious. I told him about the shoe V. There was silence. Finally, Michael said, "Don't go back to the house tonight." I didn't tell him about Daniel's notebook. I wasn't sure who I could trust anymore. That night, I stayed at a hotel. Around midnight, someone knocked on my door. I froze. I didn't answer. After several seconds, the person slid an envelope underneath the door. I waited until the hallway was quiet before picking it up. Inside was a photograph of Daniel standing beside Richard Hale. On the back were 5 words, "Your husband worked for him." I called Daniel repeatedly. He didn't answer. I spent the rest of the night staring at the photograph. The next morning, I returned to the lawyer's office. Michael looked at the picture and sighed. "I was afraid you'd find that." I asked who Daniel really was. Michael told me Daniel had once worked as a private security investigator for Richard. His job had been to locate threats around Richard's family. I asked, "Including me?" Michael nodded. "Especially you. I felt sick. Daniel hadn't met me by accident. He had been assigned to watch me." I asked why he married me. Michael said, "That part I don't know." Then he gave me another envelope. "Richard left this specifically for the day you discovered your husband's identity." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sentence. "Do not hate Daniel until you hear what he did for you." I wanted to believe there was an explanation, but I also felt betrayed. Michael told me Daniel had secretly prevented several attempts to locate me over the years. "He was supposed to report your location," he said. "Instead, he kept it hidden." That changed things, but not enough. I asked why Richard had never contacted me. Michael said, "Because contacting you would have revealed where you were." That evening, Daniel finally came back. I placed the photograph on the table. He looked at it and sat down. "You know," he said. I nodded. He admitted everything. Richard had hired him 20 years earlier. Daniel had found me when I was 19. He was supposed to monitor me, but after discovering who was looking for me, he decided to protect me instead. "Then why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because if you knew, you would become afraid," Daniel said. I asked whether he had married me because of the assignment. He looked directly into my eyes. At first, yes. My heart broke. "And later?" I asked. His voice became quiet. "Later, you became the most important person in my life." I wanted to believe him, but 9 years of secrets couldn't disappear because of one confession. I asked him about Thomas Vale. Daniel said Thomas had been Richard's most dangerous enemy. Years earlier, Thomas had discovered that Richard had a daughter. He believed finding me would allow him to control Richard. But Richard moved me before Thomas could reach me. Your mother helped him, Daniel said. But she didn't know the whole story. I finally understood why my mother had always been terrified of Richard's name. She thought he was dangerous. But according to Daniel, Richard had been trying to protect me from someone else. I asked who my biological father really was. Daniel stared at me for a long moment. You already know, he said. Richard Holay. I suddenly realized the inheritance wasn't random at all. I wasn't a stranger to him. I was his daughter. I confronted my mother that same night. She finally told me the truth. Richard was my biological father. They had been in love when they were young, but Richard's business grew dangerous. When I was born, someone inside his company tried to use me as leverage against him. My mother took me and disappeared. Richard spent decades searching for us without knowing whether we were alive. I asked why. She never told me. She said she was afraid I would search for him. And if you found him, she whispered, they would find you. I asked who they were. She looked toward the window. People who believed your father would never have another heir. Then she told me Richard had contacted her shortly before his death. He knew someone had discovered my identity. Richard had asked my mother to tell me everything if he died. She refused. She was still afraid. But he left something with her anyway. She went upstairs and returned with a small wooden box. Inside was an old key and a letter. The letter said, Emma, the truth is not in the house. It is beneath the place where you first learned to read. I immediately thought of my childhood school. Daniel drove me there that night. The building had been renovated years ago, but the old library still existed. We searched beneath the wooden floor until we found a loose panel. Underneath it was a metal box. The key from my mother's house opened it. Inside were dozens of documents and one old cassette tape labeled with my birthday. We found a cassette player in the library office. When I pressed play, Richard's voice filled the room. Emma, if you are hearing this, I am gone. He explained that he had discovered Thomas was stealing from the company. But Thomas wasn't working alone. Someone inside Richard's family had helped him. Then Richard said something that made me stop the tape. The person closest to you is not who you think. I looked at Daniel. He immediately said, it's not me. I asked how he could be sure. He said Richard had given him another recording. But before he could explain, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was inside the library. Daniel switched off the lights. We stood silently in the dark. A shadow passed beneath the door. Then someone whispered my name. The voice was my mother's. I opened the door. She was standing there, terrified. She told us to leave immediately. Thomas knows about this place, she said. I asked how she knew. She refused to answer. Daniel looked at her and said, you were followed. My mother nodded. Then she handed me a photograph. It showed Thomas standing beside a man I recognized instantly. The man was my Uncle David. He was my mother's older brother. I had always believed he died before I was born. My mother admitted that he was alive. He had worked for Thomas for years. Suddenly, the family story made sense. Someone had been feeding information about me to Thomas from the beginning. And it wasn't a stranger. It was someone connected to my own family. We left the library through a side entrance. My mother told me David had helped hide me as a child, but eventually betrayed her. He believed Richard's money should belong to the people who had built the company, not to an unknown daughter. Thomas promised him a fortune if he helped remove me from the inheritance. I asked my mother why David had never found me. She said Daniel had stopped him. For years, Daniel had secretly protected me from David's network. That was why Richard trusted him. I finally understood why Daniel had stayed silent. But there was still one question. If Thomas knew about me, why had he waited until Richard died? Daniel answered, Richard had created a legal trap. If anyone tried to harm me before his death, his lawyers would expose evidence against them. But after Richard died, the protection disappeared. Thomas thought he could manipulate me into signing away the company. The inheritance wasn't simply a gift, it was bait. Michael confirmed the plan. Richard had deliberately made me the heir because he knew Thomas would reveal himself. Every attempt to control me would create evidence. Every suspicious move would be recorded. Richard had spent years preparing for the possibility that he wouldn't survive long enough to protect me personally. Then Michael told me something even stranger. Richard's will contained a hidden clause. I couldn't access the company's full assets until I discovered the reason he had chosen me. The lawyer wasn't allowed to tell me. I had to find the answer myself. If I failed, control would pass temporarily to an outside trustee selected years earlier. I asked who the trustee was. Michael looked at me and said, "Thomas Vale." I felt my stomach drop. The entire inheritance had been designed as a test. Thomas would eventually offer to help me. If I accepted, he would control everything. Richard had warned me from the beginning. Don't trust the first person who offers to help. But why $12 million? Why make me the heir at all? Daniel said Richard wanted to give me more than money. He wanted to give me freedom. For most of my life, other people had made decisions for me because they believed they were protecting me. Richard wanted that to end with him. He wanted me to have enough power to choose my own life. We returned to Richard's house and searched the office again. Behind a painting, we discovered another safe. This one required no key. It opened with my fingerprints. Inside was a final folder containing bank records, photographs, and a handwritten family tree. At the bottom was my name. Under it, Richard had written, "My daughter, my greatest mistake, my greatest reason to survive." There was also a letter addressed to me. Richard admitted he had made mistakes. He should have found me sooner. He should have told me the truth. But every time he came close, someone around him leaked information. He believed staying away was the only way to keep me alive. Then he wrote, "I never stopped being your father, even when you didn't know I existed." I cried for the first time since the investigation began. I had spent days thinking about the money. Now, the money barely mattered. I wanted answers about the years I had lost. I wanted to know what my father sounded like when he laughed, what food he liked, whether he had ever thought about me on my birthday. Then I found another folder. It contained recordings from every year of my life. Richard had recorded short messages for me. When I was 7, he wished me a happy birthday. When I was 16, he said he hoped I had found good friends. When I graduated, he said he was proud of me. He had never sent the recordings. He had simply kept them. Then came the final recording. Richard looked older and tired. "Emma," he said, "if you're hearing this, I failed to survive long enough to meet you." He paused. "But if I did everything correctly, you are standing in my house, reading this, and wondering why I chose you." He smiled faintly, because there was never anyone else. The recording continued. Richard explained that the company, the money, and the houses were never the real inheritance. They were tools. He wanted me to have the resources to protect myself and the people I loved. But he also wanted me to uncover the people who had spent decades controlling my life from the shadows. Then Richard named the person closest to him who had betrayed him. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't David. It was someone I had never suspected. Michael Grant, the lawyer handling my inheritance. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Richard said Michael had been secretly working with Thomas for years, but Richard had kept him close because he needed evidence. I called Michael immediately. He didn't answer. Daniel said we needed to leave. But before we could, the front door opened. Michael walked into the house. He wasn't alone. 2 men stood behind him. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said. "Your father made this much harder than it needed to be." Michael told me Thomas wanted the inheritance transferred immediately. I refused. He smiled. "You don't understand. Your father is dead. The people who protected you are gone. Daniel stepped forward, but one of the men raised a weapon. I realized we were trapped. Then I remembered something Richard had said. If you reach the end, don't fight them. Let them believe they've won. I pretended to surrender. I told Michael I would sign whatever he wanted. He relaxed. While he prepared the documents, Daniel secretly triggered the security system Richard had installed years earlier. Cameras began recording everything. Michael didn't notice. I signed the first page, then asked him to explain the second clause. He leaned toward me and started talking. He admitted Thomas had planned everything. He admitted Richard had been poised. He admitted they had manipulated the legal documents. Daniel kept the cameras running. Michael finally said the sentence we needed. Once you sign, the company belongs to Thomas. I looked at him and smiled. Thank you. Michael realized too late that the cameras were recording. He tried to grab the device, but Daniel stopped him. Police arrived minutes later. Michael and the two men were arrested. Thomas was already being tracked. The evidence from Richard's house was enough to connect them to the financial crimes, but the murder still needed proof. That proof came from an unexpected place. The old cassette recording contained a conversation between Richard and Michael. Richard had secretly recorded it months before his death. Michael admitted that Thomas had ordered him to create the inheritance trap. He also revealed where Thomas planned to meet the person who supplied the poison. Police found Thomas 2 days later. He was hiding in a cabin owned by one of his shell companies. When they arrested him, he asked whether I had received Richard's final message. The officer said yes. Thomas laughed bitterly. Then he won, he said. He always knew I would come for her. Thomas eventually confessed to the murder. He had believed Richard's death would leave the company vulnerable. He never expected Richard to prepare such a detailed plan before dying. Thomas admitted that the inheritance had been designed specifically to expose him. Richard had predicted almost every move he made. Months later, I officially became the owner of Richard Hale's company. I sold several properties and created a foundation in my father's name. I also kept his old house, not because I wanted the mansion, but because it was the first place where I had ever seen evidence that my father knew I existed. My relationship with Daniel survived, but it changed. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly. He never again hid information from me. Sometimes I asked him why he stayed with me after the assignment ended. He always gave the same answer. Because somewhere along the way, protecting you stopped being my job and became my life. My mother also changed. She finally told me everything she remembered about Richard. The arguments, the letters, the nights he waited outside our house without knocking because he was afraid someone was watching. She admitted that she had hated him for keeping secrets, while secretly knowing he was trying to protect me. One evening, I found myself standing in front of the red door again. I opened it and walked inside. The room was empty now. The photographs were gone. On the desk was one final envelope I had somehow missed. My name was written across it. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a final letter from Richard. Emma, if you have reached this point, then you know why I chose you. Not because you were my daughter. That would have been enough. I chose you because I watched you become someone strong enough to carry the truth. I had to stop reading for a moment. The letter continued. The fortune belongs to you, but don't let it become your identity. Money can buy safety, but it cannot give you a life. Build one yourself. At the bottom was a final sentence. And if you ever wonder whether I loved you, look at how much of my life I spent making sure you survived. I sat alone in that room for a long time. For years, I had believed my life was ordinary. Then one phone call had revealed that an entire hidden world existed behind it. A stranger had left me millions, but he wasn't a stranger. He was my father, and the fortune wasn't really a reward. It was the final shield he could give me after he was gone. I still have the photograph from that first envelope, the one showing me as a little girl standing beside my mother. I keep it in my office, next to a photograph of Richard I've never seen published anywhere. Sometimes I look at it and wonder what my life would have been like if he'd been allowed to be my father. I will never know, but I know one thing now. He didn't choose me because I was his heir. He chose me because I was his daughter.